Story 1.
70 miles left to Lisonville. 70 miles. The cheerful, smiling truck driver, Harry, whom Tony had stopped on the road, could only take him as far as Windhead. From there, Harry's white and red Kenworth truck was turning west and heading off to good old Oklahoma. But that was fine with Tony. From Windhead to Lisonville was just a hop, skip, and a jump. Tony cheered up. The endless plain under the scorching rays of the summer sun no longer seemed monotonous to him. On the contrary, the sky, clear as crystal, the silvery feather grass, and the rare green hills filled his soul with joy. Only now did he truly realize how much he had missed this plain during the long 3 years of his absence. Missed the light, wispy clouds, the horizon that seemed unreachable. Where he had been, the lush, damp tropics had constantly weighed him down, with almost daily rains soaking everything, softening it. The restless howler monkeys drove him mad with their wild screams, and the nocturnal four-legged and legless creatures rarely let him sleep. And the meaningless war had dulled his senses to the extreme. The only thought that kept him going was that he would return home with the money needed for him and Lizzie to get married, buy a modest house near Windhead, and start a small farm. Only the memory of Lizzie filled his heart with hope and strengthened his spirit. Now the mind-numbing sleepless nights and endless hot battles were behind him. Next to him, the cheerful chatterbox, Harry was endlessly talking. The winding ribbon of the highway stretched ahead, and the plain lay sprawling around in the heat. Tony felt lighter than ever. Lizzie. Soon he would see his Lizzie, and the world would regain its former meaning for him. "You should join us, truckers." The driver brought Tony back to reality. "Firstly, it's romantic. Secondly, no one's messing with your head, and the pay is decent. What more does a young guy like you need? Think about it. Together we could go long distances. I used to drive with a partner, but then he died. His liver gave out, or rather what was left of it." Tempting. But Tony hadn't yet thought about what he would do after the army. First he needed to see Lizzie, and as for work, let it be afraid of him. He wasn't some mama's boy who could be scared off by anything. "And it's good for the family too if you start one. I'm on the road for almost a week and home for 3 or 4 days. You should see how my wife eagerly pounces on me. Sometimes right from the doorstep. Isn't that great? And the kids? Look at these rascals." Harry extended a worn-out, smudged photo. "Tell me they weren't conceived out of love." Tony looked at the amateur photo of Harry's family with interest. In it, a plump, smiling, slightly tousled housewife was tenderly hugging 2 freckled kids who were making faces at the photographer. Tony could almost see her struggling to catch them in the yard, momentarily quieting them with a stern look. But they would continue to tease and pinch each other behind her back. No. Tony hadn't thought that far ahead yet, although he was sure that his and Lizzie's kids would be very beautiful. Nature hadn't skimped on Lizzie's beauty. Her eyes alone, as blue as a clear sky, were worth it. At the thought of his girl, Tony's heart began to pound. When would this long, exhausting journey end so he could see her again? Tony could hardly wait. But finally, there was little, modest Windhead, one of hundreds like it in this part of the state, with its familiar buildings that hadn't changed at all in the 3 years he had been gone. Time seemed to have stood still here. Harry gently slowed down at the town's entrance, said goodbye to Tony like an old friend, wished him luck and a safe journey, then turned left onto the highway bypassing Windhead. Tony headed towards the center, hoping to find a ride to take him further to Lisonville. The long road had worn him out. In the central square near the local bar, about a dozen cars were parked, likely their drivers inside having lunch. not surprising since it was past noon. Tony, not thinking twice, headed straight there. After the long journey, he was also hungry. Who knows when he would reach Lisonville? Another 7 or 8 miles at least. By car, 10 or 15 minutes. If he found a ride. Lisonville was always off the main roads. It was practically in a dead end. If only one of the locals happened to be here, that would be a stroke of luck. But Tony wasn't going to shout in the bar. "Hey, anyone heading to Lisonville? I need to get there urgently." That would be silly. People would look at him like an idiot, and showing off was never welcome here. Tony sat at one of the free tables. A young waitress, reminding him of Lizzie, approached. Lizzie also worked as a waitress when he met her. The girl smiled sweetly at Tony and asked what he wanted. Tony asked what they had. The girl told him, maybe eggs and bacon and a beer. "Would you like me to bring the beer while the eggs are being prepared?" Tony sensed that the waitress liked him, but he was only thinking about Lizzie waiting for him in Lisonville. "Yes, please," he said, and the girl returned to the counter. While waiting for his meal, Tony looked around. A transient cafe, always sparsely populated with 1 or 2 local regulars, the rest travelers, either tourists, truckers, or sometimes hitchhikers. Tony needed drivers. He picked out 3 or 4 guys that seemed promising and decided to ask them for a ride to Lisonville after his meal. Surely someone would be going that way soon. He just had to not miss the opportunity. When the eggs and bacon arrived, Tony eagerly dug in. He just wanted to stave off hunger, hoping to soon be in Lisonville, but judging by the full plates in front of the guys, they were just starting. He'd have to wait a bit. Although, Tony finished his meal, drank his beer with satisfaction, got up from the table, and slowly approached the bartender. The bartender, a stocky, squat man with a mustache, looked at him questioningly. "There are several cars parked near your bar," Tony began hesitantly. "Do you know if any of them are heading to Lisonville?" The bartender looked at him as if he were half crazy and said nothing. "I mean," Tony tried again, "is anyone going to Lisonville?" "Where are you from, son?" the bartender suddenly asked. "And why are you heading to Lisonville?" "I have a girl there, Lizzie Crawford. Maybe you know her." The bartender gave him a suspicious look, then said reluctantly, "I don't know anyone there, and I don't want to. And I wouldn't advise you to go there if you haven't been there for a while." "Why?" Tony didn't understand. "Just because," the bartender snapped, making it clear the conversation was over. "Are you ordering anything else? No? Then hit the road and get out of here while you're still alive." The bartender stared Tony straight in the eyes. Tony turned away, trying to make sense of what he had heard. Why was he so adamant? And why did he want to scare him away from Lisonville? While you're still alive. It was strange to hear such words from a law-abiding citizen. Are we in some slaughterhouse? Or is there a war going on? Outside, cars were peacefully parked, their drivers calmly eating their meals. Maybe Tony had missed something when entering Windhead, and there was an invisible front line here? Apparently not, and seasoned veteran Tony Wright could smell war from a mile away. Tony wanted to ask something else, but as soon as he turned to the bartender and opened his mouth, the bartender cut him off. "Are you ordering anything else?" "No." "Then hit the road." Tony resentfully threw a few coins on the counter and asked, "Is this how you greet everyone in Windhead?" The bartender looked at him from under thick eyebrows and said, "Everyone heading to Lisonville." "Got it," Tony said, and dejectedly headed for the exit. The waitress looked at him with pity. The bartender snapped at her. "What are you staring at, fool? Go to the kitchen and wash the cups." The girl obediently left the room. At the door, Tony bumped into a fat policeman coming into the bar, with large drops of sweat streaming down his face. The policeman was wiping it off with a big dirty handkerchief. Giving Tony a fleeting glance, he approached the bar and asked the bartender to pour him something cold. The bartender leaned close to the policeman's ear and whispered something quickly. But Tony didn't care what they thought of him. He hadn't done anything wrong, and they had no reason to pick on him. Nevertheless, the policeman watched him intently as he left. Tony felt it on his back, but didn't turn around. Outside, near an old dusty Ford truck, he saw a gray-haired man in a red checkered flannel shirt and blue jeans. He was probably the driver, wiping the rearview mirror with a soft cloth, seemingly preparing to leave. Tony approached him. "Are you by any chance going to Listenville?" The driver looked at him warily. Tony asked again, "I need to get to Listenville. Do you know anyone heading that way?" The driver got into the cab, slammed the door loudly, turned the ignition key, and then said to Tony, "Nothing's been going to Listenville for half a year." He started the truck and drove off, leaving Tony in a cloud of dust, bewildered. How can that be? Tony thought. Could Listenville not exist anymore? Although no one told him it had disappeared, everyone became strange at the mere mention of the town. Tony didn't know what to do. Someone tugged at his sleeve. He turned his head. The waitress from the bar stood next to him. "What do you want?" Tony asked her absently. "I heard you're looking for a ride to Listenville. Don't do it. It's not worth going there." The girl's voice trembled. Why not? Tony didn't understand. Would someone finally explain to him what the hell was going on here? But instead of an answer, Tony heard only a commanding, "Becky." The policeman who had come out of the bar said it. The girl immediately wilted, turned around, and hurried to the back entrance. Tony looked at the policeman with displeasure. The girl could have told him something important, but this pompous cop interrupted her, and now Tony would remain ignorant because of him. Tony was getting angry. The policeman slowly approached, never taking his eyes off him, and demanded his documents. "So you just got back from there?" he said, as if talking to himself. "Okay. But why do you need to go to Listenville? Are you local? I don't recall seeing you before." The policeman's curiosity and bluntness began to irritate Tony. "Am I not a free person? Can't I go where I want?" The policeman smirked crookedly. That's what some movie hero said when the sheriff stopped him in his county. "You want to play hero with me, son? I wouldn't recommend it. Better go home and forget about Listenville. There's nothing for you there." The policeman handed Tony his documents back. "I hope you take this good advice." The policeman left Tony alone, got into his car, and as he drove past, saluted him. Tony looked after the police car in bewilderment. No one helped him. No one even explained why he shouldn't go to Listenville. Maybe there's a cholera outbreak or the plague wiped out the population. But wouldn't that be immediately disclosed? They would have told him straight away. Instead, there were only hints, threats, and fear. It made him even more determined to get to Listenville and find Lizzie. How could he live without knowing what happened to her? He wouldn't be at peace for the rest of his life. Now it was a matter of honor. He would walk if he had to, and surely find someone on the way. That's what Tony decided, and without waiting for any drivers, he set off on foot without hesitation. If he walked briskly, he'd reach the place by evening. No doubt, on the war, they covered much greater distances. The road to Listenville branched off from the main highway half a mile from Windhead. Even if he walked, it would take him 3 to 4 hours at most, and walking wasn't new to him. He'd traveled so many miles. So many roads over the 3 years, he'd lost count. Tony still remembered this turn. He and Lizzie often stopped near it, saying their goodbyes. How many years ago was that? 3. It felt like an eternity. He promised Lizzie that as soon as he returned, he would come straight to her. Would she recognize him? And he her? Lizzie had given him her photograph. In it, she was in a pink, frilly dress near a lush old pine tree. A teenage girl. She was 18 then. Now she's over 20. A real woman. Would she remember him? In her first letter, Lizzie confessed that he was her first man. That letter, along with the other 11, he still kept in his backpack, at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, all 12 letters. In 3 years. Maybe she wrote more, but only 12 reached him. 1 letter every quarter? Less often. But they helped him survive there. Damn war. How it devalues human life. Tony looked back. Windhead had almost disappeared behind the hill. Only a few rooftops and tall antennas peeked out. Around him for miles there was nothing but plain, occasionally dotted with sparse yellow vegetation. At least it was past noon, and the heat was starting to subside. He thought he saw a white police Ford at the turn. Could the cop be seriously trailing him? Tony quickly slipped into the ditch and watched the police car from there. But it didn't take the road to Lissenville, and after standing at the crossroads for a few minutes, it turned back to Windhead. Did they spot him in the car or not? Probably not. Otherwise, they would have come here and started pestering him with their silly questions. Where? Why? Annoying. What had he done that was so forbidden that he had to hide like a criminal? Nothing. And since nothing, there's no reason to pester him. Tony got back on the road, brushed the dry grass off his pants. Somewhere above, like a sign, a lark chirped. Tony tried to spot it in the sky, but in vain. It seemed to blend with the velvety blue, and even the light white clouds appeared motionless. He had to keep going. It would soon get dark, and he didn't want to spend the night in the plain. Tony quickened his pace. He was already eager to see Lizzie as soon as possible. The closer he got to Lissenville, the more confident he was that Lizzie would recognize him immediately. She just couldn't not recognize him. After all, he was her first man. The small, squat houses of Lissenville, surrounded by sparse greenery, appeared around 6 in the evening. Tony felt a surge of warmth and recognition. This town wasn't his home, but it had become a part of his soul because his girl, Lizzie Crawford, lived here. And he had no doubt she had been waiting for him all these long, terrible 3 years. 3 years. For some, they flew by like 3 days. For others, like 3 weeks. Tony seemed to remember every day of those years. Every day. Tony entered the town. Lissenville hadn't grown at all in the 3 years he had been away. It seemed even to have declined, though the main buildings remained. In the distance, the dull gray spire of the local church could be seen. Nearby, a single-story police station and Thomas Paine's cozy little cafe. It was in this cafe that Tony first saw Lizzie. She worked there as a waitress. When saying goodbye, Tony bought her a bright red silk scarf. Lizzie gratefully kissed Tony. Lower, near the ravine, was a modest hotel with separate rooms in the courtyard. Tony used to stay there since Lizzie's mother was ill. Now she's gone. 2 years ago, Lizzie buried her. That letter was probably the hardest. It carried so much sorrow and despair, so much pleading. Lizzie had begged Tony to return to her quickly, but could he decide to stay or return then? He was a soldier. He gnawed at the wet ground, drank swampy sludge, camouflaged in lush jungles, and could only dream of ever being here again. Tony sent back a long letter, full of love and compassion, hoping it would reach Lizzie and ease her heartache. It probably did. And Lizzie must have felt better from his words. How many times had he repeated those words without letters after battles, without any assurance that she would hear them? Yes, Listenville hadn't changed a bit. The same modest wooden houses, the same white sun-faded low wooden fences, and green lawns in front of them. Except the paint on the houses had peeled a bit, and the lawns had grown wild. The town seemed to be dying. No one could even repaint their homes. Tony turned left, toward the church, and for the second time that day was surprised. He had walked almost halfway through Listenville and hadn't met a single living soul. Had everyone left? No. There by the fence stood one resident, but he looked at Tony strangely. His gaze was wary and somehow predatory. He didn't even respond to Tony's greeting. Tony walked past, feeling a chill run down his spine. What the heck, he thought. The next person Tony met also stood motionless by his fence, gripping the wooden slats, and his gaze became as oily as the previous ones as soon as Tony approached. Like zombies. Tony laughed to himself, but the laugh wasn't cheerful, more defensive. He was beginning to dislike the people and Listenville itself. How could a normal person live in such an atmosphere? If only I could see Lizzie soon, he thought, relieved when he saw her house. But it didn't seem lived in either. The lawns were overgrown with weeds, choking the once lush rose bushes under the windows. The lilac on the corner had become dense and wild. The low fence in front of the house was leaning, the paint on it, like on the house, cracked and peeled in places, hanging in ragged strips. Could it be that no one lives here anymore? Tony thought as he slowly climbed the porch steps. They creaked under his feet. The door was unlocked, though the inside wasn't ransacked. The furniture was the same as the last time he visited, though it was covered in a thick layer of dust and had darkened. The window panes were covered with fly spots. The curtains faded. Where was Lizzie? Tony walked into the living room. Nothing had changed. Even the old photos still hung on the walls. There was Lizzie, her mother, Lizzie again. Everything remained in place. But there was no sense of life. What happened? Plague? Epidemic? Tony went outside. By the fence stood people, 5 or 6 of them, staring at him intently and expectantly. Among them, Tony noticed the first people he had met earlier. All were dressed in some shabby, greasy rags. They're sick. Tony thought when he saw a man with long, viscous saliva dripping from his lips. The town is really infected with some cholera. No wonder everyone in Windhead advised him not to come here. But Lizzie, is she sick too? Or dead? Tony's mind was in turmoil. On the war, he couldn't even think such a thought. But when Lizzie's letters stopped coming 6 months ago, he feared she had forgotten him, tired of waiting, found someone else. There were so many young, enterprising, reckless guys around. Maybe Lizzie fell for one of them. Maybe she got married. That's what Tony thought there. He thought and allowed everything. Everything except death. Now he didn't rule out even that. Wasn't it obvious from these unfortunate people that they were infected with some terrible, incurable disease? Could a normal, healthy person look with such glazed eyes unless drunk, high, or utterly exhausted? And when Tony entered Listenville, and now, the expressions on these people's faces hadn't changed. They remained impenetrable. Their eyes glazed and continued to cloud. And one of them even grinned so maliciously that Tony involuntarily recoiled and painfully scratched himself on the nettles entwined in the low branches of the lilac. Tony felt uneasy. He wasn't afraid of these people, but he felt he needed to be cautious around them. A madman's actions are unpredictable. Maybe that's why they looked at him in Windhead as if he were crazy. so eager to get into this hellhole. Tony hesitated. Who to ask where Lizzie was now? Maybe she managed to get out and leave. She couldn't have stayed here after her mother died in this heating environment. Tony decisively headed towards the church. There, in the center, he thought, he would more likely find a sane person and get all the answers. The crowd, like it was tied to him, followed Tony but kept a distance, seemingly waiting for something. Like wolves, Tony thought, never taking his eyes off them. From afar, he saw the familiar cafe with the large faded sign, Thomas Paine. Lizzie used to work there, so Thomas Paine should know where she went. Who else? On the narrow winding path, Tony turned towards the cafe. At the entrance, arms crossed over his broad chest, stood the owner himself. Tony still remembered him. Thomas Paine remained a large and strong man. Seeing Tony, he seemed not to react to his appearance, not even raising an eyebrow, but noticing the crowd trailing Tony. He arched his back, dropped his arms, clenched his huge fists, and glared at the followers. They stopped, hesitant to move further, but Paine found it insufficient. He suddenly barked, "Get lost, mutts!" And the crowd immediately thinned out, soon completely dispersing into the hidden corners. Tony was surprised, but didn't change his decision. Approaching Thomas Paine, he was about to ask about Lizzie when he suddenly saw her through the cafe's window. She stood frozen, staring right at Tony. "Lizzie, Lizzie." His mind pounded, and he barely restrained himself from rushing to her. Something held him back. What? He couldn't understand. But he felt he was doing the right thing by not rushing to her. Besides, he wouldn't be able to bypass the giant Paine, who towered over him like a colossus. Dealing with this one would take a while, Tony thought, and looked back at the cafe window, but Lizzie had already disappeared. Hadn't she recognized him? Thomas Paine gave Tony what seemed like an appraising look, like a butcher evaluating livestock before slaughter. Tony tried to distract himself from these intrusive thoughts. He suddenly wanted to meet Lizzie alone. Where could he send Paine? Tony asked, "Your town is small. I guess there's no place to stay overnight?" "Why not?" Thomas Paine looked at him arrogantly. "I have rooms nearby. You can rent one and spend the night." "Wonderful," Tony exclaimed, not hiding his joy. Here was a chance to get Paine away. "Then maybe you could prepare one for me? Do you have help?" "I'll send my wife," Thomas Paine said. "Room 11. It's the warmest. Wait near it. Lizzie will be there soon. How long are you staying?" "I don't know yet. Maybe a day, maybe more. Depends on my business." "Business?" Thomas Paine smirked. "What business could there be in our quiet town?" "I'm meeting someone here." Tony lied without blinking. "We have an arrangement. He should arrive soon. Maybe tomorrow." "Well, business is good. Room 11. Go diagonally. My wife won't take long." Thomas Paine turned and disappeared into the cafe. Lizzie, Lizzie. Tony's mind raced. Could she have become this clumsy Paine's wife? Couldn't she wait for me, or did something serious happen? Tony didn't know what to think. All the hotel cottages looked the same, differing only by small, nailed-on numbers. Tony easily found room 11 and anxiously waited for Lizzie. He hoped she would come alone so they could talk without interruption. 5 minutes later, the girl appeared from behind the cafe and slowly approached. Tony was on edge. It was her, his Lizzie. Though she had changed, she looked gaunt and darker. He would recognize her among 1,000. How could he forget those dear features? They had appeared in his dreams throughout the long 3 years of separation. How many times had he imagined their reunion? Imagined embracing her, holding her close, looking into her charming eyes, gently running his fingers over her face to feel every dimple, every contour, every trembling vein. But now he probably wouldn't even be able to exchange a few words with her. At the corner of the cafe stood Thomas Paine again, in his monumental pose with crossed arms. Even from here, it was clear how much suspicion and hostility his gaze held. Yet Tony dared to speak to Lizzie, keeping an eye on Paine. He spoke in a half-whisper, barely moving his lips, fearing Paine might read them, and Tony didn't want any trouble for Lizzie. But it was hard to restrain himself. Lizzie, he saw, was also agitated. She had recognized him after all, couldn't forget him, and how unbearable it was to be so close and not even touch each other. Tony and Lizzie reached the room. The girl gestured for him to stop, opened the door, and entered. Tony half hidden from Paine's view, but didn't dare step inside. He might lose control, fall at her feet, and start kissing them. In these strange and unpredictable circumstances, it would be madness. For now, Tony could only secretly admire his beloved and keep an eye on Paine. As soon as Lizzie entered the room, she forgot about the bed, pressed her chest to the door jamb from the side invisible to her husband, and fully gave in to her emotions. She quickly and almost incoherently, through gasps and sighs, started talking. There was so much love in her words, so much joy and yet so much pain. But Lizzie, Lizzie. Tony couldn't hold back. Why? Why are you with him? Don't ask, Tony, don't ask, my love. I'm not the same at all, the girl said and cried. Lizzie, Lizzie. Tony was breathless with excitement. But why can't we leave? I came for you, Lizzie, for you. No, you can't, Tony, you can't, not anymore, she cried again. And you can't stay here. There's death. Death all around, Tony. Leave. I won't go anywhere without you, Lizzie. Nowhere. The girl was desperate. Please leave and don't ask anything. Please, Tony, please. They didn't finish talking. Tony noticed that Thomas Paine, apparently worried about the prolonged check-in, was heading straight towards them. Tony told Lizzie, and she quickly started making the bed. When Paine appeared at the threshold, Lizzie had already wiped her tears and was dusting the tables. Why so long? He asked sternly. There's so much dust here, she replied, hiding her red eyes. You know, there haven't been guests here for a long time. Okay, go. That's enough cleaning. Paine stared intently at Tony, and when Lizzie left, smiled maliciously and said, I wish the young man a peaceful night. Just make sure to lock up tight. Our little town may be small, but it's restless. Newcomers often find it uncomfortable. Thanks for the warning, Tony said, not taking his eyes off Paine's. I'll take your kind advice. Paine left, and Tony immediately bolted the door. How strange everything was in this Listenville, he thought, left alone. At first, no one wanted to give him a lift. Then the odd bunch of sickly folks following him, then a subdued Lizzie and this Paine with his cryptic hints. And the atmosphere? Some kind of suffocating atmosphere, some incomprehensible feeling of something unusual. And animals. How had he not noticed right away? He hadn't seen a single dog or cat on his way. He couldn't recall if he had even heard the chirping of ordinary sparrows in the town. The air was dry and stale, the buildings dilapidated, the people sick, the strange pain, the tormented Lizzie. Tony felt suffocated. What's going on here, damn it? He kept asking himself, unable to find an answer. It got dark. Tony crawled into bed, trying once more to analyze what he had seen and heard, but he couldn't make any sense of it. Everything was too vague, too mysterious, and inexplicable. What was he going to do? Lizzie clearly didn't love her husband. That was immediately obvious. Maybe Paine was holding her by force, tied her to him with debts, threats, or fear. Closer to midnight, Tony heard distinct footsteps outside the door. It seemed someone was sneaking around the windows, trying to remain unnoticed. Occasionally, a shadow would flit across the window illuminated by the bright full moon. And suddenly Tony heard a clinking sound. It was like someone had kicked an empty beer can. Tony had excellent hearing. Rising from the bed, he listened. The sound didn't repeat. Even so, Tony got up, dressed, approached the window, and peered out from behind the curtain. It seemed like no one was there. And again it seemed to him that a shadow slid across the ground. Tony unbolted the door and flung it open. About 25 yards from his cottage stood the same 5 or 6 people Tony had taken for sick. They stood rooted to the spot, staring at Tony. The huge round moon was behind them, so neither their eyes nor expressions were visible. Tony got scared and quickly shut the door. He was in plain sight. He was completely exposed and defenseless. Tony was initially confused, but then tried to pull himself together. It wasn't clear what they intended, but he wouldn't give in easily. He would defend himself. He would fight. To the death. He was convinced that the state of Lizzie was partly their fault. They had taken Lizzie from him. They had made her this way. Tony tried to muster the courage to assess the situation rationally, but he had so little time. Someone was already tugging at the door handle. Someone was scratching the window glass. Tony ripped the wooden bed from its place and dragged it to the door, barricading the entrance. He added a heavy nightstand on top and then a chair. Maybe it would hold. They kept pushing against the door. One hit, then another. It was a pity he didn't have a gun. He would have shown these thugs what for. Still, Tony unscrewed the leg from one of the nightstands. In skilled hands, it could be a formidable weapon. Tony felt its weight. If he struck well, he could not only subdue an attacker, but also send him to the next world. In the meantime, the pounding on the door continued. The bolt had long been knocked off, and the barricade was even slightly shifted by the force of Tony's attackers. It was astonishing how powerful and strong these brazen intruders were. Outside, there was a real uproar. Every kind of noise filtered through: screeching, clinking, dog howling, and animal growling. It felt like the entire missing animal kingdom had gathered around Tony's cottage. They had already broken the window, and the upper half of the door was cracking, and Tony didn't even know what to do. He huddled in the corner opposite the door, clutching the nightstand leg tightly, prepared for anything. But what he saw stunned him with its unpredictability. When the upper half of the door shattered into splinters from another strong blow, the gaping maw suddenly revealed a snarling, slobbering muzzle of a huge wolf. Its bloodshot eyes glowed with madness, looking ravenous. Another equally ferocious face was pushing through the window. But they weren't wolves, Tony immediately understood. The beasts were bigger, more massive and bloodthirsty. If it weren't for the thick, ruffled fur and wolfish snouts, Tony wouldn't have distinguished them from people, for they smashed everything with their front paws, leaning on the door with enormous, powerful chests. Then it dawned on Tony. That's why he hadn't seen a single animal here. The whole town was inhabited by its own beasts. By day they were sick, tormented people. By night, bloodthirsty, vile creatures prowling the area for prey. And Lizzie was one of them. His Lizzie. Now he knew exactly who was to blame for making Lizzie this way. They wouldn't get any mercy from him. The werewolves, taking advantage of Tony's brief hesitation, almost burst into the room. How many were there? 6, 7, 8? Tony didn't count. They could have gathered even more during his time in Listenville. Still, what was one man against such a mass of monsters? Tony realized he had no choice and never would. He would die, but he wouldn't go down alone. He would take a handful of particularly eager attackers with him to the grave. He had nothing to lose, nowhere to run. Tony lunged at one of the monsters and jabbed the nightstand leg into its eye. It howled wildly and fell out of the window. Another grotesque face immediately replaced it. Tony punched it in the eye. He smashed a light nightstand over the head of the one pushing through the door, but it was enough to take the beast out for a few minutes. If the werewolves were those sickly creatures trailing him through Listenville, there was nothing to fear. He could handle them, but if there were a couple of giants like Payne, he'd be in trouble. He couldn't forget about them. Surely the entire town consisted of these beasts. He could only hope to break out of the room and reach some car. But that was for later. Now he needed to deal with the friends so eager to join his party. Tony jabbed another one in the eye. They left him no choice. Only brutal retaliation, remembering everything he had been taught in the war, could help him survive. And Tony got angry. He seemed to channel all the pain of losing loved ones and friends there, in the war, and the pain of Lizzie here. Only by fighting fiercely, even in a hopeless battle from all sides, could he hope to survive. How long did Tony fight the werewolves? Minutes, 2, 20, an hour? Time seemed to stand still. He was tired of shaking off the furry paws of the monsters, no longer paying attention to the stinging wounds from their sharp claws, mechanically continuing to fend off the creatures with whatever came to hand, when suddenly a huge brute appeared in the gaping door, baring its teeth and growling so fiercely that the walls seemed to shake. Tony and all the werewolves froze for a second. It was clear they were also scared of him. Now, Tony thought, his end had truly come. He couldn't handle the giant pain in this confined space, and breaking free wasn't easy. Even those who seemed unconscious under the window could attack at any moment. But as soon as the brute pain crossed the room's threshold, another werewolf leaped at him from behind, biting into his neck with sharp fangs. Could it be Lizzie? Flashed through Tony's mind, but he wasn't allowed to finish the thought. The bloodthirsty pack attacked him again, but now Tony wasn't alone. Now he wouldn't be an easy prey. Still, something unexpected happened. Someone struck Tony hard. A piece of flesh was torn from his shoulder, and sharp pain instantly clouded his mind. Tony woke up only in the morning. His head buzzed and hummed as if filled with a swarm of bees. He couldn't believe he was still alive. After such a beating, no one would have survived, let alone him, Tony, already worn and battered by life. Around him was a horrific scene. 6 or 7 mutilated bodies, unrecognizable. All dead. Tony himself felt shattered. His body ached. His shirt was in tatters. His chest covered in blood. His arms and shoulders scratched. One eye swollen shut, and he could barely see. But there was no time to lie around. He had to find Lizzie quickly, take her and get away from here. Tony got up, slowly made his way to the exit, stepping over the bodies, but stopped at the threshold. Under the window, unnaturally sprawled, lay Lizzie, horribly mutilated, with her throat torn out. Tony's legs gave way. In a daze, he collapsed next to her. She had been one of them after all, but something had stopped her from attacking Tony as her comrades had. Could she have remembered him even in wolf form? Remembered and saved his life. Oh, Lizzie, Lizzie, how absurd life is. He should have protected her, but it turned out she protected him. Here, in the peaceful sanctuary amidst the endless plain, in a small town called Listenville, in a secluded, long-forgotten town. Tony didn't know what to do now, where to go, who to turn to. Someone approached him. Tony looked up and saw the same policeman from Windhead. Even the police come here. The policeman walked up to Tony and, without explaining anything, put handcuffs on him. Tony didn't resist. He didn't care anymore. They could do whatever they wanted with him, take him wherever they wanted. He was nobody now, disgusted with life. He didn't know why he should even live. For what? The policeman lifted Tony from the ground and led him away, probably to the station. He led him without asking any questions. For that, Tony was grateful. The last thing he wanted right now was to explain anything. Passing by the cafe, Tony thought he saw Thomas Paine standing behind the glass, but looking more closely, which wasn't easy given his swollen eye, he saw nothing. The cafe was empty. At the station, the policeman shoved Tony behind bars. Tony collapsed onto the bench by the wall and soon fell into a dead sleep. He was utterly exhausted. As he drifted off, he noticed the policeman pulling out a bottle of aperitif and placing it on the table. When Tony woke up, the station was lit, and the policeman was sitting at the table with another man. This second man was huge. His back turned to Tony. Tony was still weak, so he didn't get up, pretending to be asleep. The men were talking about something. The policeman often laughed in a short, staccato way and squinted his eyes. The large man occasionally turned around, but Tony, peeking through a web of eyelashes, couldn't make out his face clearly. By his build, the man reminded Tony of Thomas Paine, but he wasn't sure. Losing interest in the pair, Tony started to recall the events of the past day. How incredible they seemed. Strange people, Thomas Paine, Lizzie. It all felt like a dream, an absurdity. Tony sat up. Maybe it was time to confront these idiots. By what right were they holding him here? Had he robbed someone? Killed someone? Tony was about to shout at the policeman, but the policeman noticed Tony had awakened and nudged the man sitting next to him. The man half turned, and Tony almost screamed. The big guy was indeed Thomas Paine. Seeing Tony, Thomas Paine grinned broadly, showing his teeth, and growled low like an animal. At that moment, the muscles on his arms, shoulders, and back tensed and bulged, his shirt started to tear, and his torn, bloody face began to transform into the hideous muzzle of a wolf. A monstrous, bloodthirsty, enormous wolf.
Story 2.
I am a fool. I did not appreciate what I had. I didn't value my life, neglected my friends and relatives, and the people who sought to help and support me. I was hasty to escape it all, I muttered, my voice blending into the heavy silence that hung over the room. The gloom swallowed the words as soon as they left my lips. Resting my forehead against the cool, damp wall, I let the cold seep into my skin. The monotony of my past life, the repetitiveness of work and return home day in and day out seemed far away now. It gnawed at me then, a constant rat of dissatisfaction chewing through my sanity. I felt destined for more, for something special, something out of the ordinary. Be careful what you wish for, right? Now, I wasn't sure if I'd even live to see the morning. I've locked myself in this room, shrouded in a darkness so thick. It feels palpable, almost solid. No one could enter this room but me. My plan was to be safe, but it turned out differently. My breathing became heavy and irregular with fear, and in the darkness I felt someone else breathing beside me. In that oppressive darkness, someone was breathing heavily and coming toward me. And then I heard her whisper, "What a lovely night." A woman's voice, clear as a bell, eerie in the quiet. My blood turned to ice. My heart pounded against my ribcage like a desperate bird trying to escape a cage. My hand scrambled for the doorknob, and I shot out of the room. Out of there, into the night, into the unknown. A year ago, I wouldn't have been in this godforsaken place. A year ago, I was just Tom. Tom with a wife, a mortgage, a secure job, and a life as mundane as it was comforting. But then, the divorce happened. It rattled me, shook me to the core. I looked at my life and realized I was unhappy. So I decided to change it. I threw caution to the wind, quit my job, sold my house. I bought a motorhome, a cozy little thing that promised freedom and adventure. My golden retriever, Bucky, was the only piece of my old life I brought along. He was my companion, my friend, my anchor in the storm of change. For over a year we traveled. From the vast plains of Texas to the towering mountains of Colorado, from the sun-kissed beaches of California to the bustling streets of New York. Every new place brought new acquaintances, new experiences, and a chance to earn a little money. I found odd jobs wherever I went, relying on my charisma and easygoing nature. I loved it, loved the novelty, the freedom. I lived for the unexpected, for the thrill of waking up to a different view outside my window every morning. The wind in my hair, Bucky's excited barks echoing around us as we hit the open road. For a while, it was everything I wanted, everything I thought I was missing. The sun was inching towards the horizon when Bucky and I rolled into a small town nestled at the edge of a picturesque forest. It was a place forgotten by time, where the charm of yesteryears still lingered on the peeling paint of the houses and the cobbled streets. My motorhome rumbled into an old gas station, a relic from a bygone era. The building stood there like a lonely sentinel, aged and worn down, seemingly abandoned. But a sign on the door caught my attention. Night shift worker needed. The salary listed was good, better than any odd job I had taken up till now. It was the perfect opportunity to bolster my dwindling budget. An old man emerged from the building, leaning heavily on a cane. His long, thick beard was streaked with silver, a stark contrast against his dark, wrinkled skin. He was very tall, nearly scraping the doorframe as he stepped out, but painfully thin, his old, shabby clothes hanging off his bony frame. He looked stern, almost grim, his eyes guarded. This was Theodore, the owner of the gas station. Our conversation was brief. He introduced himself, outlined my duties, and without further ado accepted me for the job. He didn't ask anything about me, where I came from, why I was here. It was odd, but I shrugged it off. On the road, I'd encountered all kinds of people. Theodore was strange, no doubt, but not the strangest. With my new job secured, I decided to take a walk through the sleepy town. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. The buildings lining the streets were old, quaint, their architectural details hinting at the town's age. There was an unusual calmness. Most people were either at work or confined to their homes. I crossed paths with only a handful of locals. I nodded in greeting, and they returned it with cautious smiles. There were only 2 grocery stores, a testament to the town's slow pace and limited needs. It felt like a bubble, untouched by the rapid evolution of the outside world. Time seemed to have slowed down here, suspended in a gentle sway of nostalgia and tranquility. It was calming, appealing in a way the constant change of the road wasn't. For a man on a journey, a man of movement, the allure of such profound stillness was strange, but undeniable. I decided to stay for a few days, soak in the serenity, and replenish my funds. As darkness fell on my first night at the old gas station, I felt an eerie tranquility enveloping me. Bucky sat by my side, his eyes reflecting the glow of the dim gas station lights. We were isolated on the old road, with the vast black forest around us. The first hours were uneventful. I went about my duties, cleaning, tending to the pumps, inventorying the sparse merchandise on the shelves. As the hours passed, a feeling of unease began to creep in. The gas station, a charming relic during the day, took on a different aura in the night. The shadows played tricks on the corners of my eyes. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, and every creak of the old building felt like a whisper in the wind. But Bucky was by my side, and his calm presence was comforting. Despite the odd vibes, I brushed it off as first-night jitters. It was past midnight when I saw the lights of a car approaching. An old model, its bodywork reflecting the stories of its years. A man stepped out, dressed in a long coat and a plaid hat, shadowing his features. He filled up his car with practiced ease, then walked towards the counter. "Good evening," he greeted, a small smile playing on his lips. His voice was deep and resonant, the timbre of it oddly calming. "Cold today, isn't it?" he said, filling the silent night with his voice. We got talking then, about the weather, about cars, about the landscape around us. He introduced himself as Edward. Edward was a seasoned traveler, a man who had seen the world. His stories were fascinating, his words painting vivid pictures in my mind. He spoke of his travels, how he had journeyed on this road many years ago, how much it had changed, yet how much had stayed the same. His stories were woven with a love for the area, and I found myself drawn into his tales. Throughout our conversation, Bucky behaved peculiarly. He growled when Edward first approached, then retreated behind the counter, whimpering softly. It was unlike Bucky to behave this way. But Edward didn't seem to notice, and Bucky's unease didn't escalate. I dismissed it as my faithful companion being wary of a stranger. As the night grew deeper, Edward left, his old car disappearing down the road. The rest of the night was quiet. The only customers were the stars above and the whispers of the wind. With the first rays of dawn, Theodore arrived. I handed over the night's earnings, a sense of accomplishment filling me. Despite the oddities of the night, it had been a good first shift. The next 2 nights were uneventful. Edward, the lonely night traveler, was my sole patron. His visits were like clockwork, midnight on the dot. Bucky's behavior, however, grew stranger by the hour. He'd whine at the sight of Edward, disappearing behind the counter, and sometimes refusing to leave the motorhome entirely. He was especially unsettled around Theodore. Their indifference to Bucky was odd. They seemed oblivious to him, not even acknowledging his presence. I tried to reassure Bucky, comfort him, but nothing seemed to work. On the 3rd night, I decided to leave Bucky behind. He whimpered and nipped at my trouser leg as I readied myself for my shift. His eyes were full of a fear I couldn't fathom. It was heartbreaking to see, but I felt it best to leave him behind. The night was eerily quiet as I settled in. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional chirp of a cricket outside, they filled the silence, the mundane sounds of an average night. I was in the middle of my cleaning routine when I heard the rumble of a car engine. A vintage pink convertible pulled up, its polished surface glistening under the gas station lights. A woman stepped out, her dress a retro 50s style, her hair coiffed to perfection. She approached the counter with a disarming smile, asking for directions and petrol. As I filled her car, we exchanged small talk. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, an unsettling feeling I couldn't place. Her smile, her laughter, it was oddly familiar. Her invitation to join her on her journey caught me off guard. I declined politely, but her smile never wavered. She left as abruptly as she'd come, her departure leaving an inexplicable void in her wake. The 4th night brought another visitor. Her young face contrasted against her old-fashioned dress. Her eyes held an ineffable longing. She too needed fuel, but there was more to her than a mere need for gasoline. As we conversed, her story unfolded. She had lost her love on this very road, in a devastating car accident. She was searching for him, her words filled with a desperation that made my heart ache. She claimed that he often drove past the gas station at night. Others had seen him, but she was always a moment too late. Her tale, though tragic, seemed improbable. Her state of mind seemed shaky, her loss rendering her a bit delusional. After filling her car, she smiled a sorrowful smile. Her eyes glazed over with unshed tears. She drove away, leaving me standing there, her story resonating in the silence of the night. A peculiar pattern began to emerge over the next few nights. An increasing number of my customers seemed trapped in a time warp, their outfits reminiscent of bygone eras, their cars vintage models, like they'd driven straight out of an old photograph. Their interactions were a mixture of mundane and surreal. Some were tight-lipped, their conversations limited to perfunctory exchanges, while others shared anecdotes that made my skin crawl. Stories of missed opportunities, lost time, unfinished goodbyes to their loved ones. I distinctly remember one woman. She was wearing an expensive dress. Her car was an expensive model, luxurious in every sense of the word. Her hands trembled as she recounted her tale. Her family, she claimed, had conspired against her, staging a car accident in a Parisian tunnel to end her life. The fear in her eyes was tangible, her story so wild, I was left questioning the line between reality and hallucination. The inexplicability of the events was starting to gnaw at my nerves. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, escape from the enigmatic occurrences plaguing the sleepy town. However, the lure of the generous salary kept me anchored. I reasoned with myself, sure, these customers are odd, but I'm safe, aren't I? And so, I decided to continue my stint at the gas station. Amidst all the chaos, there was one constant: Edward. Like clockwork, he'd pull up in his old car, fill his tank, converse amiably, and leave. The rhythm of his visits was almost comforting, a predictable pattern in the maelstrom of the bazaar. But that night, Edward didn't come. An unspoken worry started to gnaw at me. His absence felt significant, an ominous shift in the pattern I'd grown accustomed to. Impulsively, I decided to leave the store and walk down the road, hoping to spot Edward's car approaching. That's when I heard it. A man's voice from behind, as clear as day. "Hey boy, I see you're a real gentleman. Good people like you don't stay long in places like this." The unexpected voice made me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding, but I found no one. For a moment, I thought it was Edward. The voice held the same timbre, the same casual tone. But the emptiness around me made me question my senses. The next evening, a thick fog drifted over the town and the gas station, enveloping them in a dense, wet blanket. As I stood near one of the gas pumps, a woman's voice punctured the silence. "Excuse me, could you check the tire pressure?" I turned sharply, but the fog held its secrets well. There was no woman, no car, just the thick mist slowly swirling around me. A chill spread through my body. The fear was no longer just lurking in the shadows. It was confronting me head-on. Seeing no one around, I decided to retreat into the relative safety of the store. As I turned to leave, a sound pierced the quiet, the unmistakable hum of a car engine. It pulled into the gas station, the grind of the tires, the click of doors opening and closing. There was laughter, a murmur of conversation, a tableau of normality painted in sound. Yet when I looked around, I was alone. The gas station was deserted, a stage with no actors. The fear seized me, propelling me towards the store. I raced inside, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding as the locks clicked into place. I was terrified, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Was I hallucinating? Was it the gasoline fumes playing tricks on my mind? Or was sleep deprivation finally catching up with me? The unease deepened, wrapping its icy tendrils around my heart. I decided to close the shop and gas station. I needed to get away. As I picked up the keys from the counter, I turned back towards the door and froze. Outside, through the fog-smudged glass, stood a guy. He was in a black leather jacket, his skin pale and stretched taut over his slender frame. His eyes were the most chilling, lifeless, and glassy, straight out of a horror movie. "Full tank, please," he said, his voice a chilling echo in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands shook as I slipped the key into the door, ready to close up. "What are you doing, Tom?" he asked. His words were like ice on my spine. He knew my name. I'd never seen him before, yet he knew me. As I locked the door, my gaze drifted beyond him, into the fog. The gray was dotted with shadows, shapes of vintage cars, and specters of people. They stood silently, watching the store, watching me. Then came a rustle behind me. I turned around, my heart in my throat, to see a young boy standing there with bags of salted nuts. He grinned, his eyes dancing with mischief. He began to speak, but the words were foreign, unintelligible. The fear swallowed me, pushing me to bolt towards the back room. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I fought to catch my breath. My heart pounded in my ears as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. I was caught in a nightmare I didn't understand, and I had no idea how to escape. Shut inside the room, I locked the padlock, the click echoing in the silent space. The only sound for miles, it seemed, was the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. For a moment I let myself believe I was safe, that the solid door could keep out the strange happenings beyond it, but even as I tried to slow my erratic breathing, the air around me became heavy with the unmistakable sound of someone else's breath. In the darkness, I could hear the labored breathing of another, drawing closer with each moment. An icy shiver crept down my spine, my heart rate increasing in the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the whispering voice broke through the quiet. "What a lovely night." Turning around, my eyes barely made out a figure. The woman. The woman with sad eyes who had been visiting the gas station. She was looking for her lost love, the one claimed by a deadly car accident. The realization sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, prompting me to leap to my feet. My legs carried me towards the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Bursting out of the room, I found myself face to face with the familiar sight of Edward's car. The sound of its honking horn was like a life raft to a drowning man. Edward was in the car. The window rolled down as he urgently beckoned. "Tom, hurry up, get in, don't waste time." Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, and I found myself running to the car. The door opened with a familiar creak, and I clambered into the vehicle. The moment I was in, Edward pressed down on the gas, the station retreating into the fog as we sped away. Gratitude bubbled within me, and I found myself thanking Edward profusely. Edward glanced at me, his face grim in the dim light. "You're a good guy, Tom, but you shouldn't have worked at that gas station. Get in your RV and drive away before they know where you're staying." His words echoed in the tight space of the car, wrapping around me like a chilling prophecy. "But who are all these people, Edward? Why are they so scary? Edward, who are you really?" I found myself blurting out, desperate for answers to the riddles that had been plaguing me. Edward, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. The journey to the camper felt much shorter than it should have. As I climbed out of Edward's car, he simply gave me a solemn wave before driving off, his car disappearing into the thick fog that seemed to have grown denser with the break of dawn. I stood, staring at the camper door that lay just a few steps away. Bucky's anxious barking pierced through the stillness, a desperate call of urgency. My hand was on the door handle, about to push it open when Bucky dashed out. He growled low, barking loudly at the surrounding fog before he darted away, disappearing into the shrouded unknown. "Bucky!" I called out, my voice strained. The cold mist swallowed the echoes of my cry, returning only a haunting silence. As I strained my eyes through the dense fog, I began to discern looming figures slowly emerging from the misty veil. Their silhouettes grew increasingly distinct as they steadily advanced. They were the people from the gas station, the strange apparitions that had inexplicably marked my existence these past few days. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them draw closer. In the face of the unknown and with Bucky lost in the fog, my instincts screamed at me to heed Edward's advice. I forced my feet to move, carrying me back towards the safety of my RV. The familiar metal under my hands was a grounding force as I clambered into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, pulling away from the enveloping strangeness of the town. Fear was my guide now, a relentless motivator urging me further away from the spectral gas station and its enigmatic customers. My journey continued until I was finally free from the confining fog and found myself on a main road, the forest road now a distant memory in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached the safety of another small town that I allowed myself to breathe again. In this relatively busy township, I was horrified to learn that the old forest road had long since been erased from maps. Even more chilling was the revelation that the sleepy town, the place I had just escaped from, had burned to the ground decades ago, its inhabitants lost to the merciless flames. And the gas station, the eerie hub of my inexplicable encounters, was unheard of. Gas stations, horror story, scary night shift stories,